The blue lights hit your rear-view mirror so fast, you almost think they belong to someone else. Your hands tighten on the steering wheel, your stomach drops. It is late, the highway is nearly empty, and suddenly that calm drive home turns into one of the most stressful moments an ordinary driver can experience in America. You pull onto the shoulder. The officer does not walk up immediately. That silence alone makes people nervous. You start wondering what you did wrong. Was it speed, lane position, a broken tail light? Did you drift for half a second while checking your GPS? Did someone report your vehicle? Why is the officer taking so long inside the patrol car? Then comes the flashlight, then the knock on the window, then the voice everybody recognizes instantly. License and registration. And starting tomorrow, in several parts of the United States, new enforcement policies, updated highway safety rules, and stricter roadside penalty procedures are expected to hit drivers harder and faster than many people realize. Some of these changes involve automated enforcement expansion, aggressive distracted driving crackdowns, lane enforcement zones, and immediate citation authority for violations that officers previously handled with warnings. But here is the real question most drivers never ask themselves until it is too late. Have you ever been pulled over and realized halfway through the stop that the officer was paying more attention to your behavior than the actual traffic violation? Tell me your experience in the comments, because a lot of drivers still misunderstand what officers are truly watching during these stops. And later in this article, I'm going to explain one small mistake that causes ordinary drivers to accidentally escalate completely routine traffic encounters into suspicious investigations. And honestly, most people do not even realize they are doing it. The biggest misunderstanding people have about traffic stops is believing the stop is only about the law itself. It usually is not. The traffic violation may start the encounter, but once the lights activate behind your car, the officer immediately begins evaluating something else entirely. Risk, threat level, behavior consistency, decision-making under pressure. That starts before the officer even reaches your window. People think police are simply checking whether you broke a rule. In reality, officers are constantly observing movement patterns. Did the driver slow down immediately or keep driving too long before pulling over? Did the car weave while stopping? Did someone inside the vehicle appear to hide something? Did the passenger suddenly lean forward? Did the driver repeatedly look in mirrors? Did the brake lights flash nervously? Officers are trained to notice tiny behavioral shifts because traffic stops are unpredictable. Most stops are routine. Some become dangerous in seconds, and drivers often accidentally create suspicion without realizing it. One of the worst examples is frantic movement. A driver sees the lights and instantly starts digging everywhere. Glove box opens, backpack moves, center console slams shut, papers fly around, hands disappear under seats. From the officer's perspective, that can look extremely bad. You may only be searching for insurance documents, but the officer does not know that yet. This is why experienced officers often pause before approaching. They are observing movement inside the car first. People get offended by that. They should understand it instead. Now, here is where tomorrow's enforcement changes become important. Across multiple jurisdictions, law enforcement agencies are increasing high-visibility enforcement operations on major highways. That phrase sounds harmless, but drivers need to understand what it really means. More stops, lower tolerance, faster citations, less discretion. And in some states, officers are under pressure to aggressively enforce distracted driving rules, left lane violations, speed corridor policies, work zone compliance, and hands-free device laws. Some drivers are about to learn the hard way that warnings are becoming less common, especially on interstate highways, especially near construction zones, especially during holiday travel periods, and especially if the officer believes the driver is careless, argumentative, distracted, or dishonest. Now let's talk about the moment most traffic stops begin changing psychologically. The first question, not the request for license and registration. The first real question. Do you know why I pulled you over? That question creates panic because people suddenly feel trapped between honesty and self-protection. Some drivers immediately confess to everything. "Oh my God, officer, was I speeding? I knew I was probably going too fast." Others go defensive instantly. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." Both reactions can change the tone of the stop. And this is where people need to understand something uncomfortable. Officers are listening to much more than the answer itself. They are evaluating tone, speed, eye movement, confidence, agitation, hesitation, and emotional response. A driver who instantly becomes hostile over a minor stop can raise suspicion. A driver who appears unusually terrified over a tiny violation can also raise suspicion. That does not automatically mean guilt, but behavior matters a lot. Especially because officers know that people carrying illegal items often overcompensate emotionally during basic interactions. Now here is another thing many drivers do not realize. Silence feels suspicious to some officers, even though remaining silent is legally protected in many situations. That creates tension during stops because officers are trained conversationally to keep people talking. Why? Because talking reveals patterns, inconsistencies, stress indicators, intoxication clues, mental state, and sometimes criminal behavior. You might notice an officer repeating questions slightly differently. "Where are you headed tonight?" "So where are you coming from again?" "How long were you there?" These repetitions are intentional sometimes. Officers compare consistency. They watch whether details change under pressure. And nervous drivers often start making contradictions accidentally. Not because they committed a crime, because anxiety disrupts memory and speech patterns. This is one reason routine stops can spiral psychologically, even when the original violation was tiny. Now let me say something that some people will disagree with. Too many drivers watch internet clips and think every stop should become a roadside courtroom debate. That is a mistake. Knowing your rights matters, absolutely. But escalating emotionally on the shoulder of a highway at night rarely helps anybody. Officers are human beings, operating under uncertainty and sometimes danger. Drivers are nervous citizens, worried about tickets, records, insurance increases, or worse. That combination creates emotional friction immediately. And people say incredibly foolish things under stress. One common disaster starts with sarcasm. "Officer, do you know how fast you were going?" Driver, "Probably slower than your tax-funded ego." Now maybe the driver thinks that sounds tough. What it usually does is guarantee a worse interaction. Tone changes outcomes more than people admit. A respectful driver can still assert rights calmly. A hostile driver often transforms a 5-minute warning into a 25-minute investigation. And yes, officers notice attitude. Whether people think that is fair or not does not change reality. Now let's discuss one of the most misunderstood moments during traffic stops. When officers ask drivers to step out of the vehicle, people panic immediately when this happens because they think it automatically means arrest. Not necessarily. Under established Supreme Court precedent, officers generally can order drivers out during lawful traffic stops for officer safety reasons. But here is what matters psychologically. The moment you step out, the dynamic changes completely. Inside your vehicle, people feel psychologically protected. Outside the vehicle, under headlights with traffic flying by, most drivers feel exposed and vulnerable. That pressure affects behavior dramatically. Officers know this. A nervous driver standing roadside often talks more than they intended. And sometimes, officers intentionally separate drivers from passengers because stories become easier to compare individually. Now imagine this scenario. The officer walks back after checking your documents. "Sir, would you mind stepping out for me?" Your heartbeat spikes instantly. You start replaying everything in your head. Did they smell something? Did they run my name? Is there a warrant issue? Did somebody in the car say something? Meanwhile, the officer may simply want space away from traffic or a clearer visual angle, but the uncertainty itself causes people to self-destruct conversationally. And here comes another major mistake: over-explaining. People under pressure talk too much, way too much. An officer asks one simple question and receives a 5-minute nervous monologue. I swear I only had 2 beers, but that was like hours ago, and honestly, my friend was driving earlier and we switched because he was tired, and we stopped at another place before that, but I barely drank anything there. At that point, the driver may have unintentionally created suspicion where none originally existed. People need to understand something uncomfortable about roadside interactions. Silence feels emotionally unnatural under pressure. Most humans instinctively try to explain themselves when authority appears suspicious of them. That instinct can become dangerous, especially now that several jurisdictions are increasing DUI patrol visibility alongside highway enforcement campaigns, and officers are specifically trained to look for divided attention behavior. That means simple multitasking problems. Can the driver answer questions while finding documents? Do they fumble repeatedly? Do they lose track mid-sentence? Do they stare blankly? Stress alone can cause these behaviors, which makes roadside evaluations complicated and imperfect. Now let's talk about phones, because this is where tomorrow's changes are going to surprise many people. A shocking number of drivers still think hands-free laws only apply to texting. Wrong. In many states, simply holding the phone while driving can trigger enforcement. Some states allow one-touch activation, others do not. Some officers now watch for lap driving, where drivers hide phones below window level. Others monitor glow reflection on faces at night. And yes, many departments are using elevated observation vehicles specifically designed to see downward phone use through windshields. Drivers think they are being subtle. Most are not. The problem becomes worse because distracted driving laws are increasingly tied to enhanced penalties near work zones, school zones, or high-risk highway corridors. And here is what many people fail to understand about modern enforcement. Officers are not only looking for the violation itself anymore. They are looking for behavioral indicators connected to the violation. For example, someone drifting between lanes while staring downward may trigger suspicion far beyond simple distraction. The officer may begin wondering about impairment, fatigue, intoxication, or medical issues. One tiny driving error can open the door to a much larger investigation. That is why body language during the first 60 seconds matters so much. Drivers underestimate how quickly officers form impressions. Hands shaking violently, avoiding eye contact completely, overly rehearsed speech, sudden aggression, unusual calmness, rapid breathing, repeated swallowing. Officers notice these things because they are trained to. But here is the dangerous part. Normal, innocent fear can resemble guilty behavior. That reality makes traffic stops psychologically complicated for everybody involved, especially at night. Especially when multiple officers arrive, especially when drivers do not understand what is happening. Now let's discuss passengers because this area creates confusion constantly. Passengers often believe they can either say absolutely anything or absolutely nothing without consequences. Reality is more nuanced. Officers frequently observe passengers just as carefully as drivers, sometimes even more carefully. Why? Because passengers often react differently under pressure. A driver may remain composed while a passenger panics visibly, or the opposite. And officers sometimes intentionally create conversational separation between occupants. One officer talks to the driver, another casually questions the passenger. They compare timelines quietly afterward. People think this only happens in major criminal investigations. No, it happens during ordinary highway stops too. Now imagine the tension inside the vehicle. The driver is trying to stay calm. The passenger suddenly blurts out, "We are not carrying anything illegal." Nobody even mentioned illegal items yet. That single sentence can completely shift the encounter. People sabotage themselves this way constantly. And then there is the issue almost nobody discusses honestly: document handling delays. Drivers become suspicious when officers keep licenses or registrations for extended periods. The stop begins feeling endless. Minutes stretch psychologically. You start wondering whether they are searching databases, waiting for backup, checking warrants, or trying to build probable cause. Sometimes they are. Sometimes dispatch systems are simply slow. But prolonged uncertainty increases anxiety dramatically, and anxious drivers often begin making mistakes. They exit vehicles unexpectedly. They start recording aggressively while yelling. They repeatedly interrupt. They demand immediate explanations. All of that changes the emotional atmosphere. Now, recording police during traffic stops has become a huge issue across America. Many drivers immediately pull out phones before the officer even reaches the window. Legally, recording police in public is generally protected in many situations, but there is an important reality people ignore. How you record matters. Quietly documenting the interaction is very different from escalating theatrically for social media. Officers can usually tell the difference immediately. And here is the part many internet videos leave out. Some drivers intentionally provoke confrontation because they want viral footage. Real roadside encounters are not entertainment. They are unpredictable legal interactions involving stress, authority, uncertainty, and safety concerns. One emotional mistake can alter your night permanently. Now let's get into another area where tomorrow's highway crackdowns may create problems. Lane discipline enforcement. People laugh about left lane rules until they get stopped for them. In many states, officers increasingly target drivers camping in passing lanes because it contributes to aggressive traffic patterns and road rage. And the dangerous part is that drivers often do not realize they are creating traffic disruption behind them. They think, "I'm already going fast enough." That logic does not necessarily matter legally. Some states specifically require slower traffic to move right regardless of current speed, and officers are becoming less patient about it, especially on congested interstates, especially during enforcement campaigns. Now here is something else drivers rarely think about. Officers pay attention to emotional transitions. A driver may begin calm but become increasingly irritated during delays. That shift itself can attract attention. Why? Because escalating emotional volatility sometimes correlates with hidden issues. Again, that does not mean guilt automatically, but officers are trained to notice changing behavior, and honestly, many drivers unintentionally talk themselves into searches. This happens constantly. Officer: "You don't have anything illegal in the car, right?" Driver laughs nervously. "Well, define illegal." That may sound harmless. It is not. Humor under stress often backfires because officers do not know whether the joke hides nervous truthfulness. Another huge misconception involves consent searches. Drivers often do not realize they can refuse consent in many situations, but the way refusal happens matters enormously. A calm response sounds very different from a confrontational one. "I do not consent to searches, officer." Simple, clear, controlled. Compare that to, "You're not searching anything because cops violate rights every day." One response maintains professionalism, the other raises emotional tension instantly. And remember, refusal alone does not necessarily establish probable cause. But hostile escalation can extend interactions unpredictably. Now here is where things become psychologically exhausting for drivers. Repeated questioning. Officers sometimes circle back to earlier topics repeatedly. "Where did you say you were headed again? What time did you leave? Who owns the vehicle?" Drivers begin feeling trapped because the same questions keep returning. That repetition creates pressure, intentionally sometimes. People under stress tend to alter details unintentionally after repetition. Officers know this, and many drivers start second-guessing themselves even when telling the truth. Then comes silence. One of the most uncomfortable tactics during stops is silence. The officer simply stands there quietly after a question. Humans hate silence. People rush to fill it, and that is when extra information pours out unnecessarily. A lot of experienced investigators understand this psychological reality very well. Now let's talk about one issue almost every driver fears. The officer suddenly changes tone. At first, the stop seems relaxed. Then something shifts. The officer becomes sharper, more formal, more direct. Maybe backup arrives. Maybe the flashlight starts scanning interiors more carefully. Maybe another officer appears near the passenger side silently. At that moment, drivers start mentally spiraling. What changed? Sometimes the officer noticed contradictory information. Sometimes dispatch returned something unexpected. Sometimes the officer simply became cautious. But drivers often react emotionally the moment tone changes. That reaction itself can worsen outcomes. People start rambling, arguing, sweating visibly, reaching around nervously. And officers are trained to notice all of it. Now let me mention something many Americans still misunderstand about innocent behavior. There is no universal innocent behavior during high-pressure encounters. Nervous people act nervous. Guilty people also act nervous. Calm people may be innocent. Calm people may also be dangerous. That ambiguity is exactly why traffic stops feel tense on both sides. And tomorrow's stricter highway enforcement environment means officers in many regions will have less patience for borderline behavior and technical violations, especially speed combinations. What do I mean by that? Not just speeding alone, speeding while holding a phone, speeding while weaving, speeding near construction crews, speeding while following too closely. Those combinations increase citation likelihood dramatically because they suggest higher risk decision-making. And insurance consequences can become brutal. That part gets ignored constantly. People focus on the ticket amount itself and forget the long-term damage. Points, premium increases, license complications, employment consequences for commercial drivers, background review issues for certain jobs. One stop can become financially painful for years. Now let's discuss fatigue, because this issue quietly causes enormous numbers of stops. Officers watch for fatigue indicators constantly during nighttime patrols. Lane drifting, delayed signaling, uneven speed maintenance, late braking, wide turns, micro-corrections inside lanes. Many exhausted drivers genuinely believe they appear normal behind the wheel. They do not. And fatigue creates another dangerous problem: confused communication. An exhausted driver may answer questions slowly, forget basic details, or appear impaired unintentionally. That can rapidly complicate roadside interactions, especially if the officer smells energy drinks, sees bloodshot eyes, or notices delayed reactions. Now imagine this scenario, because it happens more often than people think. The officer asks, "Have you had anything to drink tonight?" The exhausted driver pauses too long trying to process the question. That hesitation alone changes the atmosphere. People underestimate how quickly suspicion builds from small, cumulative observations. Not one thing, several things combined. And officers are trained specifically to evaluate clusters of indicators rather than isolated actions. Now here comes one of the most important things drivers need to understand moving forward. The roadside is not emotionally neutral territory. Everything feels amplified there. Flashlights, traffic noise, uniforms, darkness, public exposure, authority pressure, fear of legal consequences. That environment changes human behavior dramatically. Even polite drivers sometimes sound defensive. Even innocent people sometimes appear evasive. Even simple questions can feel accusatory under stress. And officers know this. Good officers manage tension carefully. Poor communication from either side can destroy that balance quickly. One phrase can change everything. One sarcastic comment, one sudden movement, one aggressive interruption. Now let's address another dangerous myth spreading online: the belief that refusing every interaction automatically protects you. Reality is more complicated. Yes, constitutional protections matter deeply, but practical roadside communication still matters too. You can be firm without being reckless, calm without surrendering rights, respectful without volunteering unnecessary information. People who understand emotional control usually navigate traffic stops far better than people obsessed with winning verbal battles. Because the shoulder of a highway is not the place to perform legal theater. And honestly, some drivers become their own worst enemy by trying too hard to sound clever. Officers hear rehearsed phrases constantly now because social media has trained people to mimic scripted roadside behavior. Sometimes that scripted behavior sounds unnatural immediately: forced confidence, artificial legal language, overly dramatic rights speeches. Officers notice when someone sounds performative instead of genuine, and that can create additional tension, especially during high-alert enforcement periods. Now let's talk briefly about commercial drivers, because tomorrow's enforcement changes may hit them especially hard. Commercial vehicle operators face much stricter expectations during highway stops. Logbooks, inspection compliance, weight restrictions, hours of service issues, equipment checks, fatigue scrutiny. And unlike ordinary drivers, commercial citations can threaten livelihoods directly. A single serious violation may trigger employment review or insurance complications for entire fleets. That pressure creates enormous stress during stops, and officers know commercial drivers sometimes fear citations more than ordinary motorists do. Now imagine sitting in a cab at 2 a.m., exhausted after hundreds of highway miles, watching patrol lights flash behind you near a way station corridor. That tension is real, and mistakes happen fast under fatigue and stress. Now here is something people rarely hear discussed honestly. Officers also experience pattern fatigue. After hours of stops involving lies, intoxicated drivers, aggressive behavior, warrant arrests, or dangerous encounters, some officers become more suspicious generally. That affects roadside dynamics too. Drivers often assume every stop begins from a blank emotional slate. Not always. Human beings carry previous experiences into future interactions, whether they intend to or not. That reality does not excuse misconduct, but understanding it helps explain why some stops feel tense immediately. And this is exactly why emotional self-control matters so much for drivers. You cannot control the officer's mood. You cannot control departmental policy. You cannot control enforcement campaigns. But you can control your own behavior. And that matters more than most people realize. Because officers constantly assess whether a stop feels stable or unstable, predictable or unpredictable, safe or risky. The driver who moves slowly, communicates clearly, avoids sudden gestures, and stays emotionally controlled usually creates a calmer interaction automatically. Now, does that guarantee a warning instead of a citation? Of course not. But it often affects the overall direction of the encounter. And tomorrow's stricter enforcement environment means many officers will rely even more heavily on behavioral interpretation during roadside contacts, especially when deciding whether to escalate investigations, request searches, conduct impairment evaluations, or issue immediate citations. One final thing before we end this conversation, because this part matters more than people think. Most drivers fear the obvious mistakes: speeding excessively, driving intoxicated, texting openly. But many serious roadside problems actually begin with emotional mistakes instead. Panic, ego, sarcasm, rambling, sudden movements, needless confrontation, trying too hard to appear innocent, trying too hard to appear fearless. Traffic stops are strange, psychological environments where ordinary people suddenly operate under pressure while being evaluated in real time by trained observers. That pressure changes behavior. And starting tomorrow, with more aggressive highway enforcement rolling out across multiple areas, drivers who fail to understand that reality may find themselves facing instant fines, extended stops, unnecessary escalation, or investigations they never expected from what originally seemed like a minor roadside encounter. Because sometimes the most important part of a traffic stop is not the violation that started it. It is the behavior that follows after the blue lights appear behind you.